Chapter 1. You're staring at your phone again. The screen lights up every few minutes even though you know nothing new is going to appear there. The last conversation sits frozen exactly where it ended, the same short exchange you've already read more times than you want to admit. You scroll up through older messages for no real reason, pausing on the ones that used to feel normal when things between you were still easy. Now they feel like something from another life. That strange quiet after a breakup does something to a person. The world keeps moving like nothing happened. People are still going to work, still laughing at dumb jokes, still posting pictures like everything in life is simple. Meanwhile, you're walking around with this constant pressure in your chest, like your mind keeps circling the same thought over and over. How did it get here? How did something that once felt so natural turn into distance that feels impossible to cross? If you're here watching this right now, chances are the breakup didn't feel clean. There's unfinished energy there. Something about the way it ended still sits in your head like a door that never fully closed. Maybe she said she needed space. Maybe the conversation ended with frustration instead of clarity. Maybe the two of you just slowly drifted apart until one day the silence between you became louder than the connection that used to be there. And when someone becomes stubborn about the breakup, it can make the situation feel even more confusing. Because stubbornness often hides something deeper. It's that energy where a person decides they've made up their mind and they're going to stick to it no matter what. You reach out once and get a short response. You reach out again and it feels colder. Eventually you stop reaching out because the reactions start making you feel like you're pushing against a wall. That's usually the moment where most men make the mistake that quietly locks the door even tighter. The mind goes into panic mode. Suddenly every instinct is telling you to explain yourself, to prove something, to send the long message that clears everything up and fixes the misunderstanding. It feels logical in the moment because your brain believes communication will repair the distance. But relationships rarely move according to logic when emotions are involved. You already know this if you've ever tried to explain yourself during an argument that only made things worse. Words start stacking on top of each other, the tone changes, and the conversation begins drifting away from the point you were trying to make in the first place. By the end of it, both people feel more distant than before the conversation even started. Breakups often create that same kind of emotional environment. The more pressure you apply, the more the other person pulls away from it. The more energy you push into the situation, the more resistance appears on the other side. Think about the way attraction works when two people first meet. Nobody is being convinced in those early stages. Nobody is sitting down with a logical argument about why they should spend time together. There's curiosity, there's comfort, there's the natural rhythm of two people enjoying each other's presence without feeling like something is being forced into place. When a breakup happens, that natural rhythm disappears. Suddenly, everything becomes heavy with meaning. Every message feels like it carries weight. Every interaction feels like it might determine the future of the relationship. You might already recognize that feeling inside yourself right now, that sense of wanting to fix everything immediately because waiting feels unbearable. The mind hates uncertainty, so it tries to solve the situation as quickly as possible. But emotional connections don't respond well to urgency. If you've been through this before, you know how strange the silence can feel when someone who used to be part of your daily life suddenly becomes distant. You pick up your phone out of habit. You think about sending something simple, a question, a memory, a casual message that opens the door just enough to start talking again. Sometimes those messages feel good for a moment. You get a response. There's a brief spark of interaction. But if the emotional space between you hasn't shifted yet, the conversation fades again just as quickly as it started. What most people don't realize during this stage is that the stubbornness you're seeing from your ex is rarely just about the breakup itself. It's about emotional positioning. People hold on to decisions when they feel like changing their mind would make them look weak or inconsistent. That feeling can keep someone locked into distance even if part of them still cares about the connection. You've probably seen this dynamic in other areas of life too. Someone makes a decision during a moment of frustration and then sticks to it long after the emotion has cooled down, simply because reversing the decision feels uncomfortable. Relationships follow that same pattern. When emotional pressure disappears, stubbornness often begins losing its grip. The mind relaxes when it no longer feels like it's being pushed toward a conclusion. That's when curiosity quietly returns. You don't notice that shift immediately because it happens slowly. Distance changes the emotional atmosphere between two people. The absence of pressure creates space for reflection. Memories start resurfacing differently when the conflict that surrounded them fades away. You've probably experienced something like this yourself with people from your past. Someone you once felt frustrated with eventually becomes easier to remember in a positive light once enough time passes. The emotional intensity fades, leaving behind the parts of the connection that felt genuine. That same psychological process often happens after breakups, especially when both people once cared about each other deeply. If you're watching this video because a stubborn ex still occupies space in your mind, you're not alone in that experience. A lot of people sit in that same quiet moment where the connection isn't fully gone, but it also hasn't found its way back yet. And something interesting happens when you begin understanding how emotional distance actually works. The situation starts feeling less chaotic. The breakup stops looking like a permanent wall and begins looking more like a phase that both people are moving through in different ways. You stop feeling like every moment requires action. You stop treating silence like something that needs to be immediately repaired. Instead, you start observing the emotional landscape for what it really is. Two people who once shared something meaningful, now standing on opposite sides of a moment that hasn't finished unfolding yet. If you've ever found yourself replaying the last conversation you had with her, wondering what would have happened if you had said something different, drop a comment under this video when that thought hits you again. You'll be surprised how many people recognize that exact feeling when they read it. And if this moment you're going through right now feels familiar in a way you didn't expect, go ahead and like the video so more people who are sitting in that same quiet space can find it too. Sometimes understanding what's actually happening inside these situations changes the way you move through them completely. Chapter 2. A friend of mine went through something a few years ago that stuck with me because it showed how easily people make a breakup harder than it actually needs to be. When the relationship first ended, he was completely convinced that the situation could be repaired if he just had the right conversation. In his mind, the entire breakup came down to one misunderstanding that had spiraled into something bigger than it should have been. The way he saw it, all he needed was one calm moment where she would listen long enough for him to explain everything properly, and the connection they had would naturally fall back into place. That belief pushed him into doing what most people do when they feel like a relationship slipped away too quickly. He started reaching out almost immediately, telling himself he was just trying to clear the air. The first message was polite and thoughtful, the kind of message you send when you're hoping the other person still cares enough to respond with warmth. She did reply, but the tone felt different from the way she used to talk to him. There was nothing rude about it, nothing aggressive, just a kind of emotional distance sitting quietly between the words. That shift made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully explain. When someone who used to speak to you with affection suddenly sounds neutral, the silence inside that tone becomes louder than anything they actually say. Instead of stepping back, he leaned forward even more, convinced that effort would fix the growing distance. A few days later, he sent another message that carried more explanation, more reflection, more emotional weight. He talked about things he had been thinking about since the breakup, and how he understood parts of the situation differently now. She responded again, but the messages kept getting shorter, and the space between responses kept stretching longer. You could see the emotional pattern forming if you stood outside the situation and watched it unfold. Each time he tried to reopen the connection, she pulled back slightly more, like someone slowly walking away from a conversation they no longer felt comfortable continuing. One night he called me and said something that captured the entire situation perfectly without him even realizing it. He said it felt like he was standing outside a house where the door used to always be open, knocking over and over again while the person inside kept stepping further away from the door each time they heard the sound. That image stayed with me because it describes what emotional pressure does after a breakup. When someone has already decided they need distance, repeated attempts to reopen the connection can make that distance feel necessary. The strange part about his situation was that nothing changed until he finally stopped trying. That decision didn't come from some carefully planned strategy or advice from anyone else. It happened because he reached a point where he simply ran out of energy to keep chasing something that felt like it was moving further away every time he reached for it. The messages stopped, the phone calls stopped, and the constant mental rehearsing of conversations finally started fading into the background. At first, the silence felt unbearable. When you're used to talking to someone every day, the absence of that communication can make time feel slow and uncomfortable. The first week passed with no interaction between them, and he admitted that part of him kept expecting the silence to break at any moment. Every notification on his phone created a quick spike of curiosity before he realized it was something unrelated to her. But as the weeks moved forward, something subtle began changing in the emotional atmosphere surrounding the breakup. Without the repeated attempts to reopen the conversation, the tension that had been building between them started disappearing. The situation stopped feeling like a conflict that needed to be defended or explained. Instead, it became quiet space where both people were left alone with their thoughts about the relationship. During that time, he slowly began rebuilding parts of his life that had been neglected while he was focused on the relationship. He spent more time around friends he hadn't seen much during the past year, started putting more attention into work again, and filled his routine with things that had nothing to do with the breakup. None of that happened because he was trying to impress her or prove something. It happened because life naturally begins moving forward once the emotional pressure surrounding a situation starts fading. About a month after the last message he had sent her, something unexpected happened. She reached out first. The message wasn't long and it didn't carry any heavy emotional explanation. She mentioned passing a place they used to visit together and said it reminded her of a conversation they once had there. The tone was casual, almost light, like someone reopening a door they had quietly closed earlier. What stood out about that moment wasn't just the message itself, but the environment in which it appeared. When he had been pushing for conversation weeks earlier, every attempt had been met with distance. Once the pressure disappeared and enough time passed for emotions to settle, curiosity quietly returned on its own. She wasn't responding to persuasion anymore. She was responding to the memory of the connection they once shared. Their conversations didn't immediately jump back into the relationship they had before. They started slowly, the way people talk when they're re-entering each other's lives after a long silence. The energy felt different from those earlier attempts to explain everything, because neither person felt like they were defending a position anymore. The emotional environment had shifted from tension to reflection. Later, he said something that perfectly captured what had happened between them during that silent stretch of time. He told me that when he stopped trying to convince her, she finally had the space to remember who he was without the breakup sitting in the middle of every conversation. That single observation explained more about the psychology of stubborn breakups than most advice people give in situations like this. When someone feels pushed toward changing their mind, the instinct to hold their ground often becomes stronger. Emotional space removes that pressure and allows people to revisit their memories without feeling like they're being pulled toward a conclusion. The connection you once had stops being overshadowed by the argument or disagreement that ended things. You might already see parts of your own situation in that story. Maybe you've sent messages hoping to repair the distance, only to feel the other person becoming colder with each attempt. Maybe the responses you received felt polite but emotionally detached, leaving you confused about how someone who once cared deeply could suddenly sound so distant. That experience happens to a lot of people because the instinct to fix things quickly feels natural when someone important walks away from your life. The mind wants resolution, and resolution feels like something that should be achieved through effort. Emotional connections rarely follow that logic once they've entered the fragile space that exists after a breakup. Distance has a way of reorganizing how people remember a relationship. When the conflict fades into the background and the pressure disappears, the mind begins returning to moments that once felt meaningful. The emotional picture changes slowly, often without either person realizing it while it's happening. And if you've ever found yourself thinking about an ex long after the conflict that ended, things stopped feeling intense, you've already experienced how memory works in situations like this. Once the emotional noise settles, the parts of the connection that felt genuine start rising to the surface again. Chapter 3. Somewhere along the way, after a breakup, a strange shift begins happening inside your own mind before anything changes between you and her. It doesn't happen loudly. It isn't some moment where you wake up one morning and suddenly feel completely different about everything. The change is quieter than that. It begins in the spaces where the constant urge to reach out slowly fades and your attention starts returning to parts of your life that existed long before the relationship ever began. You might notice it when you wake up one day and realize the first thought in your head wasn't about her. Maybe the thought still comes later in the day. Maybe it still appears when something reminds you of a place you used to go together. But the grip it had on your mind at the beginning isn't quite as tight anymore. That shift feels small when it happens, yet it quietly changes the way you move through the world. When someone has become stubborn after a breakup, the energy between you usually stays locked in a certain emotional position. She has drawn a line in her mind about how things ended, and every interaction you have with her gets filtered through that decision. The more she feels like she has to defend that position, the more firmly she holds on to it. That's why chasing clarity often makes the situation harder instead of easier. When the constant attempts to reopen the conversation disappear, the emotional environment changes in ways that are difficult to notice at first. The tension that surrounded the breakup stops being refreshed every few days by another conversation that leads nowhere. Silence begins doing something that effort couldn't accomplish earlier. It gives both people space to experience life without the relationship being the center of every thought. You may not realize it while it's happening, but this phase changes how you carry yourself. Instead of moving through the day with a quiet sense of urgency about fixing something, your energy becomes calmer. Conversations with other people feel more natural again. The way you laugh, the way you talk, even the way you walk through familiar places starts feeling lighter, because the emotional weight you were carrying begins dissolving. When a breakup is fresh, the emotional presence you bring into interactions often carries traces of the conflict that ended the relationship. Even if you try to hide it, people can feel when someone is holding on to unresolved tension. That energy shows up in small ways. It appears in how quickly you respond to things, how carefully you choose your words, how much meaning you place on every little interaction. Once enough time passes and you stop trying to control what happens next, that tension gradually disappears. The version of yourself that begins showing up in the world starts looking more like the person she originally connected with before the relationship became complicated. You may not even notice the difference at first because the change feels internal, but other people often notice it before you do. Friends comment that you seem more relaxed again. Conversations feel easier. You stop carrying that subtle urgency that used to appear whenever her name crossed your mind. What's interesting about this stage is that it quietly resets the emotional picture she remembers about you. When the breakup was fresh, The last interaction between you probably felt heavy, emotional, or frustrating. That final moment becomes the most recent memory attached to the relationship. As time passes and no new conflict replaces it, that memory slowly loses its intensity. The mind begins filling the empty space with older memories instead. Conversations that used to feel normal come back into focus. Moments where you both laughed about something random suddenly feel vivid again. The connection you once shared starts resurfacing in ways that weren't possible while the breakup was still emotionally active. You might not see that process happening on her side because it unfolds privately inside someone's thoughts. People rarely announce when their perspective about a relationship starts shifting. It happens gradually as they move through their own life, encountering small reminders of the past in places they didn't expect. Sometimes it's a song playing somewhere that brings back a memory of a moment you shared. Sometimes it's a conversation with a friend about relationships that causes them to reflect on what your connection used to feel like. These moments appear quietly and disappear just as quickly, but they accumulate over time. While that's happening, something else begins changing in your own life. The more you invest energy back into yourself, the more your identity stops revolving around the breakup. You begin rediscovering parts of your personality that may have faded into the background while the relationship was the center of your attention. Your routines become more structured again. The things you once enjoyed start feeling interesting again. You catch yourself thinking about the future without the relationship automatically appearing in the middle of those plans. That doesn't mean the connection you had stops mattering. It simply means your life starts expanding beyond the emotional moment where it paused. Ironically, that's often when the possibility of reconnection begins becoming real again. People are naturally drawn toward individuals who carry a sense of direction and stability in their lives. When someone sees that you've returned to moving forward instead of circling around the past, the image they hold of you begins shifting as well. Instead of remembering you as the person who was trying to fix the breakup, they begin seeing the version of you that exists beyond that moment. If she eventually reaches out again, the conversation no longer feels like an attempt to repair something broken. It feels like two people reconnecting after spending time apart, each having moved through their own reflections about what happened. The absence of pressure creates room for curiosity to exist again. You may have experienced something similar before in other relationships or friendships. Sometimes people drift apart and later reconnect in a way that feels surprisingly natural, almost as if the time apart quietly rearranged how both people saw the situation. When you're standing inside the silence that follows a breakup, it's easy to believe nothing is happening. It can feel like the connection has simply frozen in place. In reality, emotional distance often allows both people to move through the necessary reflections that could never happen while the conflict was still active. You might still have moments where the thought of her appears unexpectedly. That's normal when a relationship once carried meaning in your life. But if you look closely, you'll probably notice those thoughts beginning to feel different from the ones that appeared right after the breakup. They arrive with less urgency and more perspective. If you've started noticing that quiet shift inside yourself where life begins feeling steady again after the chaos of a breakup, keep paying attention to that change. It's often the stage where people rediscover the version of themselves that existed before the relationship became the center of everything. Chapter 4. There's a point that arrives quietly during this process where the situation stops feeling like something you're trying to fix and begins feeling like something you're simply observing. You still remember her. The connection still holds meaning. But the emotional storm that followed the breakup no longer controls the direction of your thoughts every day. That shift changes the way you move through the world in ways that are subtle yet powerful. When people talk about getting an ex back, they often imagine some moment where the right words magically change everything. The mind searches for the message that will unlock the door, the conversation that will suddenly remind her of what the relationship meant. But human connections rarely respond to perfectly crafted sentences the way people hope they will. What changes relationships most often is the emotional environment surrounding the two people involved. Once enough time passes and the pressure surrounding the breakup fades, the energy between you and her begins existing in a completely different atmosphere. The last conversation you had with her no longer sits at the front of her mind the way it once did. The intensity of whatever disagreement ended, the relationship begins fading into the background of memory, replaced by other thoughts that life naturally brings into someone's day. During this stage, something interesting starts happening on your side as well. The version of yourself that existed when the breakup first happened slowly disappears. That earlier version of you was reacting to pain, confusion, and the fear of losing something meaningful. Every thought you had about her carried a sense of urgency, like the situation needed to be solved before time ran out. That urgency fades when enough days pass without the relationship dominating every moment of your life. You begin waking up and thinking about your plans for the day before thinking about the breakup. Your conversations with friends start revolving around things happening now instead of what happened weeks ago. The relationship becomes part of your story rather than the entire focus of it. When someone sees that you've moved forward emotionally, the way they view the breakup changes too. The stubbornness that once held them firmly in their decision starts feeling less necessary. Instead of feeling like they need to defend the distance between you, they begin seeing you as someone who exists beyond the conflict that ended the relationship. Curiosity doesn't arrive loudly. It appears in small moments when something reminds her of you, and the memory feels lighter than it used to. She might think about a conversation you once had that made her laugh, or remember a place you both used to visit together. Those thoughts don't necessarily lead to immediate action, but they slowly reshape how the relationship lives in her mind. What once felt like a closed chapter begins looking more like unfinished space. You might not see this shift happening because it unfolds privately inside her own reflections. People rarely announce when their perspective about someone begins changing. They simply begin thinking differently, noticing old memories with new emotional distance. Meanwhile, the way you carry yourself continues evolving. You walk into rooms with more presence because you're no longer carrying the quiet weight of trying to fix something that hasn't resolved yet. Your conversations feel natural again. The version of you that shows up in everyday life begins looking like the person she originally connected with before the relationship became complicated. Sometimes the reconnection begins with something simple, a casual message about something small, a comment about a place you used to go together, an unexpected reaction to something you posted that reminded her of a memory. These moments appear naturally when the emotional tension between two people has been allowed to settle. What makes these interactions different from the earlier attempts to reconnect is the absence of pressure. Neither person feels like they are defending a position anymore. The conversation becomes lighter because the conflict that once sat between you has lost its intensity. You might notice that the tone feels familiar in a way you didn't expect. The rhythm of the conversation starts resembling the way you used to talk before the breakup ever happened. That's when you realize the connection never completely disappeared. It simply needed time to move beyond the moment where it was interrupted. During these moments, it becomes important to stay present rather than trying to steer the situation toward a specific outcome. The temptation to immediately reopen the emotional conversation about the breakup can appear quickly because you still remember how painful that ending felt. But rushing back into that territory often pulls both people back into the emotional environment that created the distance in the first place. Allowing the interaction to remain light creates space for the connection to rebuild naturally. Think about how relationships usually begin. They don't start with long conversations about every disagreement that might appear in the future. They begin with shared moments, casual conversations, and the feeling that spending time together simply feels good. Reconnection works the same way. It grows through small interactions that slowly rebuild comfort between two people. If she begins showing curiosity again, the best thing you can do is let the interaction breathe. Respond naturally. Allow the conversation to exist without trying to force clarity about the relationship immediately. The emotional environment has already changed by this point, and letting that environment remain calm gives the connection room to grow again. You might feel the urge to explain everything that happened in the past, to clear the air so the relationship can move forward without confusion. That conversation can happen eventually, but it becomes far more productive once both people have rediscovered the version of the connection that existed before the breakup. The more comfortable the interaction feels, the easier it becomes for both people to remember why the relationship mattered in the first place. The past no longer feels like a battlefield that needs to be resolved. It begins looking like a shared experience that both of you are capable of understanding with greater perspective. You might already sense how different this stage feels compared to the beginning of the breakup. The emotional pressure that once filled every interaction has disappeared. Conversations no longer carry the weight of trying to prove something or defend something. They simply exist. That's when reconnection stops feeling impossible and starts feeling natural again. Chapter 5. Eventually, there comes a moment where you realize something quietly important has changed inside you. It's not something that arrives with a dramatic feeling attached to it. It doesn't feel like a victory or a final answer. It feels calmer than that. You look back at the breakup and notice that the emotional storm that once surrounded it has settled into something you can finally understand. When the relationship first ended, the situation felt like a problem that needed solving immediately. Every thought about her carried urgency. Every memory of the relationship felt like evidence that something valuable had been lost. That stage is intense for almost everyone, because when a connection ends suddenly, the mind tries to reconstruct it in every possible way. But time has a way of rearranging emotional experiences. What once felt like chaos slowly becomes perspective. The conversations you replayed endlessly in your head start making more sense. You see things now that you couldn't see when the breakup was still fresh. Not because someone explained them to you, but because distance allows clarity to appear naturally. You begin noticing how the relationship had rhythms you never paid attention to before, moments where communication became strained, times when both of you were reacting emotionally instead of listening to each other. Those realizations don't arrive with blame attached to them. They simply become part of your understanding of what happened. Earlier in the process, the thought of reconnecting might have felt like something you needed in order to feel complete again. Now the idea feels different. If the connection returns, it happens between two people who have both moved through their own reflections about the relationship. When two people reconnect after emotional distance, the energy between them often carries a level of maturity that wasn't present during the breakup. Neither person feels like they're trying to prove something. The conversations feel calmer because the urgency that once surrounded the relationship has faded. That environment allows a new version of the connection to appear. You may notice that the way you talk to her now feels different from the way conversations unfolded near the end of the relationship. You listen more carefully. You speak with more clarity. The emotional tension that once triggered arguments doesn't appear as easily because both of you have experienced life separately for a while. Sometimes the reconnection grows naturally from there. Two people rediscover the parts of the relationship that once felt easy and meaningful. Other times, the interaction simply becomes a peaceful understanding between two people who once shared something important. Either outcome carries value. What matters most is the way you've moved through the experience. You've seen how chasing answers during the emotional storm of a breakup rarely leads anywhere productive. You've experienced how space can reshape the way both people see the relationship. And most importantly, you've rediscovered the version of yourself that existed before the relationship became the center of your thoughts. You begin understanding that relationships grow strongest when both people bring a sense of stability into them. When someone feels grounded in their own life, the connection becomes something that enhances that life rather than something that defines it completely. If you and your ex eventually find your way back to each other, it will likely happen in the quiet moments where neither of you are trying to force the outcome. Conversations return naturally. Familiarity rebuilds itself through shared experiences instead of long explanations about the past. You might meet again somewhere ordinary, a place where the memory of your earlier connection feels comfortable instead of heavy. The interaction may start casually, with both of you noticing how much calmer the situation feels compared to the last time you spoke. Those moments carry a sense of quiet understanding. You see the person in front of you with new perspective, recognizing both the good parts of the relationship and the lessons that came from its ending. The past no longer feels like something that needs to be repaired. It becomes part of the story that brought both of you to this new moment. And if the relationship begins growing again from there, it grows on a foundation that includes everything both of you have learned since the breakup. If you're still moving through the earlier stages of this experience right now, remember that clarity tends to arrive slowly. Emotional situations rarely resolve themselves on the timeline our minds would prefer. The process often requires patience, reflection, and the willingness to let life move forward, even while part of your heart is still catching up. What you may eventually realize is that the journey through a breakup often teaches you more about yourself than the relationship ever could on its own. You learn how you handle emotional uncertainty. You discover how much resilience exists inside you when something important changes unexpectedly. You see how life gradually rebuilds itself around you, even when a chapter closes that you once believed would last forever. Those lessons stay with you long after the relationship itself has either returned or become part of your past. And if watching this video brought back memories of a breakup you once thought would never stop hurting, take a moment to leave a comment about it. Someone else reading it might recognize the same experience in their own life and realize they're not the only person who has walked through that kind of emotional landscape. If this conversation helped you see the situation from a clearer perspective, share the video with someone who might be going through a similar moment right now. Sometimes hearing another way of looking at the experience makes it easier to move through it with patience. And if you want more conversations like this about relationships, psychology, and understanding the patterns that shape connections between people, subscribe so you don't miss the next video.